War is another reason for Voltaire's lack of optimism, because the 7 Years' War began the following year, 1756. As they say, France and Great Britain were enemies again. His comment on war, many comments. All murderers are punished unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets. In 1759, Voltaire bought an estate at Ferney, today called Ferney-Voltaire, just within the French border, but distant from the French Catholic authorities, and just out of reach of the Genevan Protestants, who were also unhappy with him, mainly because he loved the theatre. At a few hours' notice, he could hop from one country to another. One can see now that Louis XV exiling of Voltaire was, in fact, providential, if one believes in providence. How? Because exile matured him morally and socially into a dedicated man of conscience. He became an outsider, as elusive as royalty, as mysterious as Aslan, fighting a guerrilla war on the periphery, but still part of the main Enlightenment battle being fought in Paris by the philosophes working on the great encyclopédie for which Voltaire wrote many, many articles. Here we see him, the workaholic, dictating to his secretary before breakfast while struggling to put his trousers on. Exile didn't mean isolation, though. An endless stream of visitors came to Ferney from all over Europe and England and even America. He complained that for 14 years now I have been the innkeeper of Europe, unpaid, of course. Benjamin Franklin found him charming because he blessed Franklin's 8-year-old grandson, in the name of God and liberty. Dieu et liberté. Boswell went to see him in 1764 and was invited to stay at Ferney for a night or two. Boswell asked him if he still spoke English. Voltaire replied, "No, to speak English, one might put the tongue behind and between the teeth, and I have lost mine." Exile, above all, led to his becoming a hard-working lord of the manor at Ferney, planting trees, starting cottage industries, looking after his peasants well, and redressing wrongs. It involved him for the first time with ordinary people. It was preparation for the next step in his life. What step? He was soon to become the champion of justice through his intervention in the Cala, Sylvain, and Labarre cases, among several others. What were the cases about, and why are they important now? The Cala, or Calas, I prefer Calas, family lived in Toulouse. Remember, Toulouse. The father, Jean, aged 62, was a prosperous cloth merchant, and they were, unfortunately for them, Protestants. One of the four sons, Louis, had already converted to Catholicism and had left Toulouse. The youngest, Donat, was an apprentice in Nîmes. One evening in October 1761, one of the other sons, Marc-Antoine, committed suicide. The whole family was charged with murdering him to stop him converting to Catholicism. In March 1762, because Jean still refused to confess, the judges decided that he should be tortured, not once, but twice. First, his arms and legs were stretched on the rack. Then he was forced to drink 20 jugs of water, still no confession. He then had to walk barefoot to this scaffold in the main square. There he was tied to a big cartwheel, and his arms and legs were broken with iron bars. After hanging there in agony for 2 hours, he still hadn't confessed, so he was mercifully strangled to death, and then his body was burned. Madame Calas and young Donat fled to Geneva, where Voltaire met them. After rigorous questioning, he was sure of the family's innocence and was convinced that Jean Calas had been a victim of gross injustice. As Ian Davidson says in his Voltaire in Exile, this is one of the most dramatic turning points in Voltaire's life and a key moment in the history of penal reform in Europe. After 3 years of sustained effort, Voltaire got the verdict overturned. Jean Calas was rehabilitated posthumously, and Louis XV himself gave £36,000 in compensation to the Calas family, now minus their father. Calas was only one of several cases of religious injustice that Voltaire took up. I shall briefly outline the two most shocking. Jean-Paul Sylvain and his wife, Protestants again, had 3 daughters, one of whom, Elizabeth, was mentally unstable. On the 6th of March, 1760, Elizabeth disappeared. The Bishop of Castres eventually revealed that she'd been abducted on his orders and held in a convent because she wanted to convert to Catholicism. After 7 months, even more deranged, she was returned home because she had consistently refused to convert. In December, the girl's body was found at the bottom of a well. The Sylvain family were accused of murdering her because she wanted to convert. But they'd been forewarned and had fled to Lausanne in Switzerland, where they lived in poverty for many years. The parents were condemned in their absence to be hanged, and the 2 daughters banished. Voltaire was already busy with the Calas case, but he reacted with the same anger when he heard about the Sylvain family. It took him 9 years of tireless lobbying and letter writing before the Parlement, the Supreme Court of Toulouse, again, was forced to acquit the Sylvains and restore their property. Now, to the case, quickly, of the Chevalier de la Barre. On the night of the 6th of August, 1765, a wooden crucifix was vandalized on the bridge at Abbeville in northern France. There were no eyewitnesses, but 2 18-year-old freethinkers were accused. One of them was La Barre, whose room was searched, and the most damning evidence was found: a copy of Voltaire's philosophical dictionary. So obviously he did it. La Barre was sentenced to have his right hand cut off and his tongue torn out. Then he was burned alive. By the way, the last European live burnings by the Inquisition were in Spain in 1783 and in Mexico in 1850. Despite great efforts, Voltaire was unable to stop the cruel punishment and death of La Barre, but the case haunted him, especially because a key piece of so-called evidence was La Barre's possession of his own philosophical dictionary. After the La Barre case, Voltaire feared for his own safety and left Ferney in haste for Switzerland. Voltaire's hostility to the Church has to take into account his experience of what Christianity had become in his country and elsewhere in Europe, which was no more cruel and fanatical than it had been in an earlier period in England. Can we be complacent nowadays? I wonder. The many cases that Voltaire was defending inspired 2 overlapping works: the Treatise on Tolerance and the Philosophical Dictionary. The Philosophical Dictionary, 1764, was publicly burnt in Paris, Geneva, and other European capitals. Why? Because it contained dangerous thoughts like this: tolerance. Of all religions, the Christian one, of course, should inspire the most tolerance. But so far, the Christians have been the most intolerant of all men. It would be easy to show how far the Christian religion of today differs from the one that Jesus practiced. The one sect that recalls the times of the first Christians is surely the Quakers. And this one, what is tolerance? It is the essence of humanity. We are all steeped in frailty and error. Let us forgive one another's follies. That is the first law of nature. If Labar was reading stuff like this, he clearly deserved to suffer a horrible death without proper trial. Maybe you think that this is no longer a problem. We don't torture people now, do we? Guantanamo, anybody? Or barbecue heretics? But in Spain, only 60 years ago, I heard the Bishop of Toledo complain in all seriousness, what a pity we can't burn heretics anymore. The old spirit isn't dead, just dormant. On Monday, the 30th of March, 1778, Voltaire, whom the new king, Louis XVI, thought was the devil incarnate, arrived at the Comédie Française in Paris for a performance of his latest and last play, Irène. He was now a very sick old man of 83, suffering from strokes, prostate cancer, which eventually killed him, and coughing up blood. He had journeyed painfully from the Alps to Paris, despite the fact that Louis XV's command, exiling him from Paris, was still, as far as anybody knew, in force. Senior churchmen were searching frantically for the decree, but failed to find it. When Voltaire entered the Comédie Française, there was a huge roar of welcome. He was installed in a royal box and crowned with a laurel wreath, a heroic triumph. When Voltaire left the theatre, pale and exhausted, he was met by yet another crowd, cheering and shouting, "Voltaire, defender of Calas, Labar, and Sylvain." A few weeks later, Voltaire left Paris. At 11 p.m. on the Sunday, the 31st of May, 1778, he was seated upright in a carriage and driven secretly to an abbey in Champagne. He didn't move during the whole journey because he was tied to the framework of the carriage. He was dead, and this was his embalmed body being transported out of Paris by his family and friends. Why the secrecy? His family and friends feared as Voltaire himself had greatly feared, that the Archbishop of Paris would refuse him a Christian burial and have him dumped in unconsecrated ground. They were right. Even when dead, Voltaire was pursued by the Archbishop of Paris, who was furious at being cheated of his prey and forbade anyone to give him Christian burial. But it was too late. It had already been done at the Abbey. In Paris, all newspapers were forbidden to print obituaries, and the French Academy was not allowed to hold its customary service upon the death of a member. It's not just Voltaire who is important in the history of tolerance. Take Locke and Collins, for example, or Milton, John Milton. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. 1644, an address to the Lords and Commons. Such men serve as role models for our never-ending struggle to keep the freedoms we have. Voltaire is one of them, especially for his treatise on tolerance, 1763. This is brilliant humanitarian work, one of the most important and characteristic texts of the Enlightenment. The issues that it raises, questions of tolerance and human dignity, are still highly relevant today, unfortunately. It should be in every school and university library. Tolerance, he writes there, is essential for the physical and moral well-being of society and is in the political interest of nations. Simon Harvey says in his introduction to the English edition of the treatise, which I recommend to all of you, published by the Cambridge, of course, the Cambridge University Press. Simon Harvey says, early on in his career, Voltaire's reading of history had led him to conclude that the differences between religions constituted the single most important cause of strife in the world. Was Voltaire right? Maybe you think this is no longer a problem. Unfortunately, my list of present religious conflicts is too long to quote. But Stalinism and Nazism were not religions, were they? But they were ideological belief systems, pseudo-religions, using the same methods of coercion, fear, violence, and early indoctrination. Harvey goes on. The 20th century experience of religious and political fanaticism has led to renewed sympathy with Voltaire's humane plea for general tolerance in the public realm. But where is the evidence for that? Is it just a pious hope? How do you reason with irrational people or tolerate the intolerable? If tolerance means more than just putting up with, if it means you may be right, does it mean condoning torture, burning alive, female genital mutilation, or blowing up buses and trains? Plato's Socrates said, "It's better to suffer evil than to do it." But one man's evil is another's virtue. Who sets the limits of the unacceptable? Personally, I'd say the limits of the unacceptable are doing physical or mental harm to anyone, for a start. Voltaire himself was very intolerant about religious tyranny, but he had a deep-seated aversion to violence. He was, above all, concerned with spreading the practice of tolerating ideas contrary to one's own. He argued that the world could be a better place, not the best of all possible places, a better place if we substituted knowledge and rational thought for ignorance and superstition. That's all. Simple, really. That's all we have to do. The problem goes far beyond politics or religion. It is a problem with human nature. Zimbardo shows in that book how easy it is to make good people do evil and to get them to commit torture and murder. So why not the other way round? Woodrow Wilson once said, "If you want to make enemies, try to change attitudes." But whose attitudes? Fanatics? Forget it. They grow more entrenched with argument, and once they're in power, it's too late. But if more than most ordinary people developed the ability to see the absurdity of being taken in by pretentious assertions masquerading as universal truths, fanatics would eventually lose their power over us. Voltaire said he prayed to God for only one thing: to make my enemies ridiculous, and God granted it. He, Voltaire, was granted the gift of making fanatics look absurd. As Voltaire wrote, doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd.